There's a peculiar stillness in watching an old photograph, one where time seems paused just as a smile is halfway to forming, or an arm is caught mid-gesture. Sometimes, I find myself drifting back to those frozen moments, tracing the faint lines of a face that belonged to a grandfather I only met for a handful of hours. The kind of man who lived through tough, unspoken years and yet carried a certain quiet sort of strength, not loud or overt, but persistent and kind of mysterious. Perhaps you have known someone like that. Maybe you are that person now. This reflection is not about rushing to understand or fix anything, but about sitting gently, without judgment, inside the subtle, complicated experience of being a Gen X grandparent. This video is for those who carry memories and emotions that don't always translate easily into words. It's for the grandparents who have learned to listen more than speak, yet feel unheard sometimes. If you find yourself longing for a patient companion on this journey into understanding your place in your family and in your own heart, then this conversation is meant for you. Feel free to settle in. Let your mind rest briefly from the daily rush. And if you think this might be a space you want to revisit, there's a simple invite to stay with us softly, a quiet moment to subscribe if you wish. There is a common belief about grandparents, especially those from Gen X, that goes something like this. The job is to be the joyful backup, the feeder of sweets, the teller of stories, the bearer of a calm presence once the parents are done commanding attention. It is reasonable to assume this, given how often the media paints grandparents as these wrapped-in-love figures who exist on the sidelines, slightly removed from the hard daily tasks of raising children. This view makes sense emotionally because it feels simpler to allocate roles. The parents are for discipline and direct care, the grandparents for comfort and indulgence. It is an idea that softens the demanding realities of caring across generations. What nobody talks about, though, is how this neat division can feel like both a blessing and a lonely corner. Many Gen X grandparents find themselves in this strange position of wanting to be deeply involved in their grandchildren's lives while respecting the independence of the middle generation, their own children, now parents themselves. This situation often breeds a quiet tension that is not about rebellion or conflict, but about a yearning for meaningful connection that honors everyone's unique needs and boundaries. That emotional complexity is rarely acknowledged outside of close, honest family discussions. To understand this gently, it helps to imagine the inner life of a Gen X grandparent as a tree rooted in two different soils. One soil is the generation they grew up with, their own childhood marked by a mix of independence and emotional self-sufficiency, sometimes growing from a space of relative solitude and unspoken expectation. The other soil is the current landscape, a world where technology, social pressures, and shifting family roles paint a much different picture. The branches stretch between these two terrains, bending, sometimes struggling, but always reaching for sunlight. The laughter, the hugs, the feeling of being needed and understood. One step away from this metaphor, many Gen X grandparents recall their own upbringing, where leaving the home to meet friends or find their own entertainment was routine. Their parents were often busy with work, as the family dynamics shifted toward dual incomes more than in earlier decades. This independence fostered resilience, but also a certain undercurrent of emotional isolation. In the role of grandparent, that history shapes how they engage. They might be more inclined to give space to avoid hovering, but simultaneously feel a deep urge to protect and guide when it truly matters. Now, you might be thinking that this sounds contradictory, and it is. That tension is essential to the psychological heart of this experience. What nobody talks about in this context is the quiet emotional labor that accompanies the position of grandparent in this generation. Amid caregiving for aging parents, navigating the complex dance of adult-children relationships, and finding one's own evolving identity, many Gen X grandparents encounter fatigue, not just physical, but emotional. They wrestle with how to be present without overstepping, how to offer wisdom without feeling disregarded. This weariness is not a sign of failure or lack of love, but a natural outcome of balancing so many roles in an ever-changing family constellation. One revealing moment comes from recognizing the difference between comfort and avoidance in these relationships. Sometimes, stepping back might look like avoidance, especially to younger generations craving more engagement, but it can just as often be a form of comfort. Not avoiding, but creating a safe space for others to grow and learn independently. This nuance is subtle yet important because it uncouples behavior from judgment and instead invites reflection on intention and emotional availability. A pattern worth noticing is how this emotional balancing act is not isolated to individual circumstances, but reflects larger social changes over the last 40 or 50 years. Gen X grew up with shifting family norms, increasing workforce participation of parents, and evolving expectations around child rearing and personal autonomy. Now, as grandparents, they inherit a system that demands even more fluidity, technology reshaping communication, the pressures of social comparison online, and the cultural shifts in what parenting and grandparenting mean. This situates their experience within a broader context rather than framing it as a personal shortcoming or confusion. A moment of revelation often comes when a Gen X grandparent acknowledges that the protective instincts and the willingness to step in sharply when needed mirror what their own parents may have done, but expressed differently. It can be illuminating to see these actions not as mistakes or oversteps, but as deeply human responses driven by love and sometimes by unresolved feelings from their own childhood. This awareness can soften self-judgment and promote a more compassionate understanding of the cyclical nature of family relationships. One short story that captures this well involves a grandfather who usually lets his grandson solve puzzles and minor conflicts in his own way, but suddenly appears in the school office when a bullying incident arises. His intensity and readiness to advocate surprise everyone because he generally avoids interference. This story illustrates how Gen X grandparents can balance independence with fierce protection, wanting the grandchild to learn resilience, but never alone when the wounds go too deep. This is the subtle dance of involvement that characterizes their psychological landscape. Reflecting further on the emotional self-sufficiency many Gen X grandparents developed growing up, it's helpful to remember that this doesn't mean they lack a deep well of feelings. Quite the opposite. They often carry their emotions quietly and with careful restraint, which can be misunderstood as distance or aloofness. This is where the metaphor of a tree with roots in two different soils returns to life. The core remains solid and capable of nurturing growth, even if the branches cast shadows that look complicated and sometimes contradictory from afar. What makes this generation's approach to grandparenting unique is an ability to navigate the tension between being a guiding presence and honoring the rhythms and independence of their grandchildren's and children's generations. The emotional complexity involves knowing when to step back and let others try, fail, and figure things out, and when to step up and provide unwavering support. This skill is neither simple nor linear, but a living process shaped by past experience and present realities. A gentle reframe that might offer some peace is to see this balancing act not as a sign of inconsistency or failure, but as evidence of emotional maturity. It recognizes the paradox that being deeply involved does not mean controlling, and that love is sometimes loud and sometimes silent. This understanding can relieve the pressure many grandparents feel to conform to fixed roles or expectations. Instead, it invites living authentically within the complexity. What this also implies psychologically is the operation of what some researchers call integrated emotional regulation, the ability to hold contradictory feelings with openness rather than rejection. This means acknowledging the love and the frustration, the desire to protect, and the urge not to overstep, all at once and without fear. It is a kind of emotional wisdom that takes time and experience to cultivate and is often the outcome of navigating a life that refuses simple answers. So, what takeaway questions might gently open a pathway for personal reflection? How do you recognize the moments when stepping back is an act of care rather than disengagement? What feelings come up when you think about showing protection or setting boundaries with your grandchildren? Can you sit with the contradictions of wanting to be there but not wanting to control? These questions invite a slow, compassionate journey inward rather than a quick fix or solution. This leaves us with a reframe that can feel liberating. Your complex feelings and actions as a Gen X grandparent are not signs that you're doing it wrong, but signals that you're doing it deeply human. Your blend of presence and space, your layered experience of care and independence, reflects a thoughtful engagement with both the past and present. What nobody talks about is how rare and valuable this can be in a world hungry for simple answers. And yet, in embracing that complexity, you offer a gift, one of nuanced love that quietly changes the fabric of your family's story. Returning to the image of the tree, consider how its roots do not choose one soil at the expense of the other, but anchor themselves in both, drawing nourishment from diverse sources. The branches may sometimes seem uneven, but they are alive with movement and growth. Similarly, your grandparenting is not about fitting a perfect mold, but about living within an evolving relationship that honors your rich history and the unfolding present. As this conversation settles, I want to gently acknowledge the courage it takes to reflect so deeply and to embrace the contradictions within. The very act of listening here, of sitting quietly with yourself, is a testimony to your strength and care. And if you choose to come back to this space again, know that you are welcome. No rushing, no judgment, just a steady, thoughtful conversation unfolding over time.